Welcome everyone to this final event for the Canadian Society for Humanities, Society Canadienne for Congress 2016. My name is Jason Boyd. I'm an assistant professor of English at Ryerson University, and I'm going to be the program chair, and unless I can find someone else, the local organizer for the Canadian Society for Humanities, Society Canadienne for Congress 2017, which is going to be at Ryerson. and I look forward to hosting you all there next year. It's bound to be an interesting time in downtown Toronto, trying to fit everyone into things. So it's my great honor to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, who is my good friend, Diane. Diane Jakacki, if you didn't know her last name, received her training at the University of Toronto, the University of Waterloo, Georgia Tech, and the Digital Humanities Summer Institute. She is Digital Scholarship Coordinator and affiliated teaching faculty in the Comparative Humanities program at Bucknell University, where she explores and institutes ways in which digital humanities tools and methods can be leveraged in a liberal arts environment. Her research interests circle around spatial analysis through text, especially in early modern British literature and drama. She is an assistant director of the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, technical editor for the Internet Shakespeare editions, a member of the Records of Early English Drama Executive, and the pedagogical advisory board for the Map of Early Modern London. Oh, there's a lot of acronyms to get through here. Through her relationship with the Canadian Society for Humanities, she has served on the program committees for DH 2016 and DH 2017, and will be program chair 2015, 2016, and will be program chair for 2017, DH 2017. She has published on digital humanities pedagogy and the intersection of DH and early modern studies, often with people in this room. She is proud that people in the States assume she is Canadian. And Diane is going to be talking to us about how do we teach digital humanities pedagogy in Diane.
Okay, so I'd like to start by thanking Susan Brown, John Back, Michael Elliott, and Citizen for inviting me to speak here. I'm sorry Susan isn't here because I wanted her to hear this too. So would somebody tweet out to her that it is a particular honor for me to be here because my DH, as the hashtag goes, is Canadian. And that'll come across, I'm sure, any minute across my head. Many of the people in this room have been directly responsible in ways they will never know for shaping my relationship to the digital humanities and my identity as a digital humanist. My training, my professionalization, my research, and my publication agenda. But more important, you've epitomized for me the possibilities for progressive, collaborative, thoughtful DH, and why that is crucial to the ways in which global DH should be conducted. You've also taught me that those possibilities come with responsibility, and that that responsibility cannot be taken lightly. And so I take this talk very seriously and personally. So I'm going to do something that may seem a bit daft at a digital humanities conference, and I'm not going to use any slides. I don't know if anybody does not give slides at any talks anymore, so I'm going old school. It feels weird, and I may regret the decision, but I want to resist the temptation to put up a lot of slides of computer screens and software logos and code and deliverables. I don't want this to be a workshop. Come Friday and you will find me in that mode, or next week at our DHSI. But this is different. And yet I'm not so clever as Bethany Nabisky to use beautiful abstract paintings to underscore my words. I also want to privilege the humanness of teaching and reaffirm that we cannot absent ourselves from teaching environments, even when we're talking about teaching environments. And I'm not so clever as Jackie Warnemont to express myself through myself vibrantly. And I'm not so confident as Amy Earhart when she framed disruption at last year's Citizen Conference through a close reading of DH projects and publications. But maybe as I stand up here on this not really small stage, although larger than I expected, with my iPad modeling the difficulties of talking about what we do when we teach. It will encourage you to take part in what I hope will become a conversation after what I'm sure is going to be a shortish keynote. Or maybe you'll decide that there is no way in heaven that you will ever make this mistake. So we'll see. When I proposed the title for this talk, I thought I was being clever and strategic, that here was an opportunity to participate in the discourse about access through the lens of pedagogy. I didn't realize that I was setting myself up, that I didn't want to present what could be very well be sad and disheartening. Because so often when we talk about access, we are actually talking about the lack thereof. And I went through so many drafts, so many until this morning, actually this afternoon, that took me down that rabbit hole, and I couldn't get myself back out. And yet I've been struggling lately with what it means to teach DH, why we must differentiate it from other practices of digital pedagogy, and whether in this world that is so very imperfect in so many ways that we can effectively support the digital humanities at a curricular level. As we become more attractive to our institutions as a brand, something that our presidents and chancellors can point at when they talk to trustees and donors as exemplary of the progressiveness of our institutions, more pressure is being put upon us to apply what we do with our research in the classroom. And we in this room are the ones who are expected to develop and implement curricular DH. We who have probably not experienced the learning of DH in a structured way. I'm making the assumption that most of us have experienced what amount to two educations. Our first education was in the humanities, or more broadly in the liberal arts. Chances are we fell in love with literature or history or language or philosophy or media or anthropology or gender studies or whatever our first field was because we had remarkable, passionate teachers. These powerful, charismatic knowledge sharers convinced us that we needed to be part of their community of scholars. Our second education was more complicated, and for many of us, much more idiosyncratic. We taught ourselves DH. We went to DHSI or similar training events. We read books that someone recommended, and we reverse engineered other people's code, and we picked up the tools and methods we needed to work on a particular research project. We reached out to our DH heroes, hoping that they would mentor us, and I think for me, sometimes I actually hoped they would adopt me. And then we turned around and taught our peers. So in order to create our community of scholar practitioners, we adopted very particular relationships with knowledge sharers that don't always translate into a traditional classroom, or with our colleagues in the arts and humanities more broadly. In our first education, we took survey courses and theory courses and special topic courses. But in our second education, until recently, there was no equivalent. We read Hales and McGann and Turkle and Gold and Drucker and so many others on our own, and our reading lists were as idiosyncratic as our training, and not necessarily as part of any formal course of study. Suzanne Westphal, who just texted me and said she can't believe that I would give a shout out to a Luddite, who she shared her love of early modern theater and Shakespeare with me when I was an undergraduate, and made me want to be part of her community. And ultimately, it was because of her that I went to graduate school many years after I was an undergraduate. She gave me Janet Murray's Hamlet on the holodeck to read sometime in the mid-90s, and I knew I needed to be a part of that. I didn't know what that was, but I knew it made sense to me. And when I applied to grad school, I wrote about how I wanted to study the idea of digital scriptorium. I thought that was such a cool term. It wasn't. I didn't know what DH was, but that was 2003, and you all were just in the process of branding it, so how could I know? The University of Toronto cannot be blamed for not knowing what to do with me. The University of Waterloo was much more helpful in pointing me at a secondary field called multimedia theory and design. But it was Amy Morrison who found the funding for me to go to DHSI and begin to learn text encoding. And then I got to meet Julia Flanders and Susan Brown and Ray Siemens and just about all of my DH heroes. Just as we learned idiosyncratically, there was no way that any of us could become DH generalists. We are specialists in text analysis, encoding, data or spatial visualization, desktop fabrication, augmented reality, e-print. Our methods are as varied as our subject matter, And specializations continue to grow and expand and evolve in ways that make it impossible for anyone to be fluent in more than a few. Although we're constantly teaching ourselves more ways to engage in different ways, in better ways, with our subject matter that is still mainly related to our first love. So at this point in time, when our institutions, our disciplines, the press are finally paying attention to us, for better or worse, we, the self-taught and scrappy, that was a shout out to Laura Eskins, so I can tweet that to her, now find that we have to adopt more formal pedagogical styles as we tread another new path. Those of you who attended DHSI last summer may remember Claire Warwick's keynote on the last day of week 1. What I heard Claire say, which was apparently different from what Connie Crompton heard her say, was a call for more focus on pedagogy within the fields that comprise the digital humanities. She said, or so I paraphrased her on Twitter at the time, it's very important that DH moves from research to teaching. It's important to teach people and train the next generation. She was emphatic that as we draw increasing attention from more traditional humanities departments, from our institutions, as well as from grant funding agencies, we need to be thinking about questions of longevity and sustainability in the training of new scholar practitioners, in addition to the continuing focus we must place on funding and institutional infrastructural support. Claire went on to call for more attention to be focused on digital humanities pedagogy at the undergraduate level, which you can imagine resonated for me, but in particular because a group of us at Bucknell, including John Hunter and Katie Fall, were at that moment designing a DH minor that was subsequently approved by the curriculum committee last fall. But I think what Claire was calling for was actually more specific, that it's important for digital humanists to teach people digital humanities and to train the next generation of digital humanists. That's very different than what I thought she was saying at the time. But you have to remember I'd just done the 5-day course and I was a little bit fried, and so you kind of can imagine that I was hearing what I thought she was saying. But I still think that she was talking in a way about how we incorporate DH methods at a sophisticated level in learning environment. So that finally leads me to ask the questions that we have to tackle if we're going to figure out how the heck we're going to teach DH. So those questions are these. Who do we teach and why do we teach them DH? And who are the we that teach DH to them? So first, who are we teaching and why are we teaching them? Certainly at an undergraduate level, which is what I understand, we're teaching students from across our departments and schools and colleges, and often because we look more relevant to the people across the quad than perhaps we do when we're teaching what may seem to outsiders to be more arcane, but is truly in line with more traditional approaches to our fields. It really is. My favorite class as an undergrad was a senior seminar taught by an historian and a computer scientist called History of Technology. They invited students to sign up for the course in a way that ensured it was half humanities and half engineering for seniors. This was in the fall of 1985, so our readings were a bit unusual, as we would think today. We spent a lot of time thinking about the transition from punch cards to personal computers, which were still weirdly new. But it was transformative for all of us because it was the first time we students had communicated formally across disciplines about our perspectives on technology and society. The historian and the computer scientist also happened to be married to each other, which fascinated us. When they got divorced a year later, I kind of wondered whether we in that course were one of the reasons why they didn't stay together. Why are students so fixated on their teacher's human existence? My favorite class to teach as a teacher was the first iteration of the Humanities 100 course that Katie Fall and I designed in 2014, and that we've spoken and written about before. What was so important and transformative about that course for me was how Katie and I relied on each other to teach each other just as we were teaching our students. And so it became this joyful and sometimes exhausting, but always wonderful way to teach. And that is the kind of teaching I really enjoy, when colleagues and students come from across disciplines and different perspectives on campus, and it's the DH that glues us together, and we can participate in unique dialogues and teach each other and complement the other skills. But students can't do that on their own, and certainly not as undergraduates. Katie Fall and John Hunter encouraged me to submit my text analysis course this fall as a W-2, which is an advanced writing requirement at Bucknell, because it would draw STEM students and increase enrollment for a new untried course. I joke now about bringing engineers and computer science majors over to the bright side, but at the same time that I joke about this, I know that many of them see this as is a novelty or it ticks a box that helps them on the job market. I know that the humanities majors in my classes are also trying to prove to their parents and potential employers that DH makes them more marketable. And there are students that we have taught that have gone on to get jobs at Google and Adobe and the US government because of their skill with media and GIS. And there's no shame in creating an opportunity that will help a student gain employment. I can't speak to teaching in the graduate experience in the graduate level, except for my own as a learner. Maybe that changes from program to program, where in some there's a spattering of DH in the few courses that grad students take, or in others where there is a formal certificate awarded. For me, I was hired as a research assistant, and Christine McWebb and I figured out what I needed to do together in order to help her build her project in medieval French literature. I don't know what's true in graduate programs now, and maybe when I finish talking, somebody else can help fill in that gap for me. We have to remember that we're not just teaching students, and we're not just teaching each other. We also have to acknowledge that we are always going to teach our colleagues and our administrators at our institutions. If we're going to implement curricular DH, institutional DH, then we need to make our deans and our provosts understand exactly what that means and what that requires. We need to show them that we need to teach along a trajectory, just as we do in other disciplines, and that a DH degree requires a commitment in terms of teachers and teaching spaces. If that LARB article did anything, it triggered a conversation among many to reframe how we participate in DH at an institutional level. There were so many thoughtful pieces that came in response to it. And I was struck by something that Brian Greenspan said in his piece that made the rounds in the last week or two. But that didn't necessarily have to do with teaching, but I think applies to how we push back our institutions when they make assumptions about us becoming sciencey or selling out for our students. He said, if anything, DH is guilty of making all too visible the dirty gears that drive the scholarly machine, along with the mechanics maintenance bill. Brian went on to say that the fault and burden of DH is that it reveals all the pieces of this model of post-secondary funding that seems novel to many humanists, but which has long been taken for granted within the sciences. This is the model that acknowledges that most funding programs aren't intended mainly for tenured professors to buy books and travel, but for research, their research infrastructure, and above all, their students who justify the mission of scholarship in the first place. So there's the teaching again. So then, who are we that teach DH? A quick show of hands in a small room. How many of you are tenure track faculty? How many of you are adjunct faculty? How many are graduate students or postdocs? How many of you are librarians? How many of you are alt-ac? How many of you didn't I identify? What are you?
I do the usually get speaking in the humanities. I just thought I would talk to see what page you're on about.
All right, there you go then. Welcome. What is teaching? So of those of you who raised your hands, and you all raised, you can raise your hand too. How many of you are scheduled to teach or co-teach or are embedded in a DH course this coming year? Okay. I ask these questions because you, all of us, represent the instructor pool for digital humanities across the curriculum. And I'm not convinced that our universities understand what this means in terms of human resources for instruction, what it means to teach the digital humanities. When I was on the job market, I included digital humanities prominently in my list of research interests and included digital pedagogy-rooted courses that I had taught in my teaching dossier. I applied for jobs that identified DH as one of the fields of research or administrative focus, And yet in several interviews, it became clear to me that the search committee didn't really know what they meant by digital humanities or who they wanted to hire. And they were sometimes uncomfortable or even resistant to ways in which it might be incorporated into a classroom environment. I recall a particularly awkward exchange in Fordham about Twitter in the classroom, where the search committee looked at me in mortification. I didn't get that job, dear reader. I do think that's changing, and in large part because of the efforts of scholars like Miriam Posner, Alex Hill, Brian Croxall, Mark Sample, Brian Cordell, Lee Scholar of Bassett, and many others who have shared their experiences and expertise acting as advocates to administrators and department heads and as mentors to others who follow on their heels, clarifying how such work should be undertaken and addressed, and how one should position oneself on the market and within disciplines to demonstrate success. But note that most of the people on that list are junior scholars, that so many who are representing and sharing the problems and challenges of figuring out models for best practice in DH, in teaching DH, are those who are not in positions of academic power or in traditional academic positions, many of whom are not recognized by our institutions as instructors at all because we are not tenure-track faculty. And those who are tenure-track but still untenured are questioned when they employ progressive teaching models and bring students into their DH research through their teaching as part of their understanding of what it means to teach. In my experience at Bucknell, I've tried to differentiate between working with faculty members who are already doing DH, whether or not they knew that before, and those who are curious about including an assignment or a module that is digitally inflected. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Having the DH minor makes a difference because I can work with faculty and in the classroom in a more intentional way, finding ways to create expansion bridges, as Katie Fall would say, that take undergraduates from survey to methods to special topics. But frankly, I'm swamped by the other faculty who want to reconfigure their courses so they can say they're doing DH. I can only give so many faculty workshops and consults with people who want to do a little mapping, some text encoding, some text analysis, some data visualization, without understanding what it really could lead to. And that's the difference. With all of these faculty members, I've demonstrated how I've taught such assignments, helping them to create rubrics and develop assessment techniques that emphasize critical engagement process and not fall prey to the pretty shiny. But for many, it will and probably should remain just something that's pretty and shiny. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But when we're talking about curricular DH, that means that someone, a librarian, a specialist, an instructional technologist, or someone like me who seems to defy description is embedded in or co-teaching these courses. We may not be identified as an instructor of record, but in effect we become that. In some cases we are formally co-teaching. John and I are teaching together next spring, and I'm really excited because I think, or I'm trying to convince him, that we can use the course to tease out issues that we're both interested in the public-private paranoid aspect of the digital and society, at the same time that DH can help us address ideas of social justice, such as that which Tanisha Taylor was talking about so eloquently yesterday. And that's a special topic course, if ever there was one. So tweet at John and convince him that we should teach it. What I'm saying is that the traditional model of one instructor, or perhaps an instructor plus grad student TAs for a course doesn't work in DH. The model has to change to reflect complementary teaching skill sets, and skill sets that change and evolve as the tools and platforms and devices students use to do this work expand, become more sophisticated, become more available at the same time that we're establishing for them to experience what for us were two separate educations, building a curricular DH that is both the making and the theorizing. It is wonderful when a student or a colleague can show us something that we don't already know. When someone from computer science or math or statistics or race studies or linguistics or rhetoric can reveal something about a scatterplot graph or a piece of code or a map that moves everyone's understanding forward. And we are notorious magpies for pulling what we've learned from them into our classrooms. And I love those moments. But again, we can't expect students to teach themselves. And I don't think we can survive if we continue to expect ourselves to teach ourselves everything so that we can teach it in turn to others. So how do we manage this multi-instructor model? Obviously, resources are not infinite, and the idea of co-teaching or embedding a specialist or a colleague or multiples of any of these people in a course is not scalable. And perhaps to borrow Connie's term from another panel, we should honor the bespoke nature of how we teach rather than figuring out how to scale it. Certainly, in my experience at Bucknell, I get pushback from the library about saying not now or not this semester when it comes to working with faculty in DH courses at a highly sophisticated, intentional level. But what does that mean? That courses are removed from the catalog because there is suddenly not a human resource available? We have to reconfigure ourselves, and we have to be honest about what we can and cannot teach. And we have to identify holes in our curricula and be intentional about how we fill them. Look at how Northeastern conducted its cluster hire this year, and how it recognized that in order to be more holistic in their approach to DH research and teaching, that they needed to expand the skill sets of their faculty. So how do we teach DH? We combine and refine both of our educations. We tried to sustain the way that we learned because it was so organic and intrinsic to our understanding of how computational methods could transform our engagement with our first loves, and we bring more of that into the classroom, just as we find ways to shape a more formal education for the students who we want to join us. We listen to Claire Warwick, and we train people and we train each other, because with us, we are still the next generation. So we keep going to DHSI, and we teach as we learn, and we take Ray's offer to go out and figure out what a DHSI at Congress, or at MLA, or at Guelph, or Oxford, or what becomes HILT, or any other training vehicle can be, and we make that. We make DH work for our environments by creating it meaningfully in our environments. We know that there is no one DH model that can possibly work across institutions, but we can shape DH for our institutions in a way that makes sense for us and for them. We hire the people who we need to make that happen, and we ensure that they have what they need to be part of the building and teaching of DH, whether it be curricular in a traditional sense or in something that looks more like the way traditional DH teaches, through research projects that are themselves internally and intrinsically pedagogical in the ways that they create new knowledge. We professionalize. We are the one humanities discipline I can think of that understands what it means to deal with a crisis in jobs in higher ed, because we have always been non-traditional in the ways in which we recognize ourselves professionally. It is not coincidental that the term alt-act works for DH in ways that it does not and cannot for other disciplines, because we build our teams knowing that it is not only disingenuous, but unhelpful to try to replicate a linear model that only goes from grad student to postdoc to tenure track. At the same time, you who are in positions of power need to resist the temptation that your colleagues still, wrongly I think, embrace, that the gold standard, as it was described to me by a dean of graduate studies, is the only path of value for graduate students. And that gold standard is a tenure track job. At the same time, you who are in, oh, I said that already, I got upset. You need to teach yourselves, just as we do, that the digital librarian or the alt-act for a PhD is not a consolation prize, but that in DH it is a crucial component to ensuring that if we have any chance of thinking about longevity and sustainability in our continuing efforts to fund and ensure institutional infrastructural support, you need us. We must be more honest than our colleagues and encourage rather than console. I need to learn this for myself because I still feel somehow that I failed my teachers because I did not meet that gold standard. But maybe that's part of modeling what we do. We spend so much time looking forward, and yet our mentors, our knowledge sharers, are right in front of us. As we saw last night when we heard Ian Lancashire speak to us, still trying to figure out how we are all going to keep going, still teaching each other as they teach us and we teach those who are next in line. So maybe those of us who are coming up in whatever wave of DH this is, and I've never quite figured out how it maps against feminism, I'm sorry about that, we need to stop worrying about titles and just get on with it. Make sure that we are employed, and figure out what it means for us to teach. Make sure that the academic world that we know, although it is always going to be imperfect, is going to suit what we need it to do. And because so many DH scholars, practitioners are amazingly agile and amazingly resourceful and amazingly generous teachers, we need to just get on with that too and do what has always worked for us. It's just that now we're just going to be doing it on a larger stage.